Saul Holiff was not a rock and roll man. He wore suits, he kept receipts, he answered letters within 24 hours and expected the same courtesy in return. When he first saw Johnny Cash perform in 1960 at the Flamingo Club in London, Ontario, he was running a small-time concert promotion business out of a rented office, booking regional talent into venues that smelled of cigarettes and spilled beer. He had no particular love for country music. What he had was an eye for an audience's reaction, and what he saw that night told him something he filed away like a number. This man is going to be very large, and whoever is sitting next to him when that happens is going to make a great deal of money. He introduced himself backstage. Cash was polite, distracted, half gone on something Holiff didn't name in the letter he wrote to his wife the next morning, though she probably understood. Within 2 years, Holiff was Cash's manager. Within 3, he was the most important person in Cash's professional life. Within 10, he was invisible. That is the shape of this story, and it doesn't resolve cleanly. What happened between Saul Holiff and Johnny Cash across 14 years is not precisely a betrayal. It isn't a falling out between equals, a creative divorce, or a case of one man cheating another. It is something harder to name. The slow erasure of a person who made himself necessary, who spent over a decade making something work against extraordinary odds, and who walked away in 1973 so quietly that the music industry barely noticed he'd been there at all. Cash went on to become one of the most written about musicians in American history. Holiff went home to Victoria, British Columbia, and did not discuss what had happened for the rest of his life. His son Jonathan found the recordings after Saul died in 2005. Reel-to-reel tapes, correspondence, telegrams, memos, diaries, a meticulous archive of a working relationship that Cash's biographers had treated as a footnote, if they mentioned it at all. Jonathan Holiff spent years assembling this material into a documentary, My Father and the Man in Black, released in 2012. What the archive reveals is not a simple story of exploitation. It is something more uncomfortable. A portrait of 2 men who needed each other badly, who built something real together, and who did not, in the end, come out of it the same way. Saul Holiff grew up in London, Ontario, the son of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. His father ran a small business. Saul was sharp, organized, self-educated in the particular way of people who read everything they can find because formal access is limited. He did a stint in the Israeli military in 1948, returned to Canada, worked in used car sales, then drifted into concert promotion the way people drifted into things in that era, by noticing a gap and deciding to fill it. His early clients were nobody in particular. He booked Jerry Lee Lewis into Ontario venues, ran some rockabilly shows, made a modest living at the edges of the entertainment business without ever quite breaking into the center of it. He was not a charming man in the show business sense. He didn't drink or schmooze. He was exacting, sometimes cold, and he sent letters when other people made phone calls because he wanted everything documented. These qualities would prove both indispensable and isolating in the years ahead. When he attached himself to Cash in 1961, he was 33 years old and Cash was 29. Cash was already famous, or near enough. I Walk the Line had come out in 1956. Guess Things Happen That Way in 1958. He was a Sun Records artist, then Columbia, and he had a television profile and a recognizable voice and a problem that everyone around him understood and nobody was addressing. He was using amphetamines and barbiturates in quantities that had begun to affect his professional reliability in serious ways. He showed up to concerts impaired, or didn't show up at all. He destroyed hotel rooms. He missed recording sessions. His marriage to Vivian Liberto was deteriorating under the weight of his absences and his state. Holiff took none of this on faith. He demanded and received a management contract, and from the first week he began doing what he would do for the next decade. applying the habits of an organized, sober, methodical man to the career of a chronically disorganized, frequently incapacitated genius. This was not a romantic arrangement. The letters make that clear. Holiff wrote to promoters, to booking agents, to record company executives, to television producers, to Cash himself, in a tone that was businesslike to the point of terseness. He tracked payments, disputed unfavorable contracts, lobbied for better billing, demanded respect from venues that had grown accustomed to treating country artists as a lower tier. He kept a running ledger of what Cash owed and what Cash was owed, and he was not sentimental about either column. Cash, for his part, was not an easy client even in his best periods. He was visionary and impulsive, and often unreachable. He had his own ideas about where his career should go, some of which were commercially sound and some of which were not, and he did not always tell Holiff what he was thinking before he acted on it. There are letters in the archive from Holiff to Cash that begin in professional language and end in something closer to exasperation. The exasperation of a man who has done everything right on his end, only to find that the other person has made a unilateral decision that undoes 3 months of preparation. And yet it worked. The evidence that it worked is in the trajectory of Cash's career during the Holiff years. When Holiff took over management, Cash was booking regional dates and was considered a prestige act with reliability problems. By the mid-1960s, Holiff had negotiated Cash into a different level of the industry. He secured the bookings at Carnegie Hall in 1962, a significant signal to the mainstream entertainment world that this was not a regional country artist to be packaged and discarded. He worked the television relationships that would eventually produce the 1969 ABC variety show, The Johnny Cash Show, a program that ran for 2 years, won awards, and fundamentally altered how the American public categorized Cash. No longer a genre act, now simply a major American entertainer. The Prison albums need separate consideration because they are the most famous things Cash made during this period, and because Holiff's role in them has been consistently underreported. Cash had been performing at prisons since the late 1950s. It was something he felt personally connected to, stemming from his own brushes with the law and his conviction that the incarcerated deserved an audience's attention. Holiff did not discourage this instinct, but the organization of what became Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison in 1968 involved the kind of months-long logistical effort that required someone to do the work that Cash couldn't or wouldn't do himself. Negotiating with Columbia Records about the commercial viability of a live prison album at a moment when Cash's chart presence had been declining. Coordinating with California Department of Corrections officials. Managing the recording logistics. Columbia was not enthusiastic. Bob Johnston, the producer, was the one who pushed hardest internally for the project to go forward. But the external pressure, the professional credibility that made Columbia willing to invest in the recording at all, came in part from what Holiff had spent years building. The argument that Johnny Cash's instincts were worth following even when they looked commercially eccentric. Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison was released in May 1968. It reached #1 on the Billboard country charts and crossed into the mainstream pop charts, a rare achievement for a country record in that era. It put Cash back on magazine covers. It generated the television special and eventually the ABC show. It is, by any measure, the commercial and cultural pivot point of his career. Saul Holiff is not a name that appears prominently in most accounts of how it came to be. The drug problem did not go away. This is important to understand because some accounts of this period soft focus it into a before and after. Before June Carter, darkness. After June Carter, light. The reality recorded in Holiff's archive is more jagged. Cash and June Carter had been involved romantically since the mid-1960s, and they married in February 1968, 2 months before the Folsom Prison release. June was a genuine stabilizing force, and Cash did significantly reduce his amphetamine use in the late 1960s. But the addiction was not resolved in a single conversion. There were periods of sobriety and periods of relapse throughout the Holiff years, and Holiff dealt with the consequences of both. The consequences were professional in the immediate sense. Canceled shows, refunded deposits, angry promoters, reputation damage that Holiff then had to spend time and leverage repairing. But they were also personal in a way the letters document without quite naming. Holiff was a man who ran on competence and order, and he had tied his professional identity to a situation that was, at its core, not orderly and not entirely within his control. The letters he wrote to Cash during periods when Cash was unreachable or impaired have a particular quality. Patient on the surface, pressurized underneath. The letters of someone who has decided that losing his temper in writing is a tactical mistake. He did lose it occasionally. There are moments in the correspondence where the professional restraint breaks and something raw comes through. The frustration of a man who has done everything asked of him and cannot understand why the other party cannot do the same. Cash's responses, when he responded, were rarely apologetic in any sustained way. He was generous and he was fond of Holiff, but he did not seem to fully comprehend what the management of his own disorder cost the people around him. By the early 1970s, several things were changing simultaneously. Cash's mainstream visibility was at its peak. The television show, the constant touring, the recordings, the public profile as an American institution. But the business of being at that level had grown more complex, and the relationship between Cash and Holiff had developed tensions that went beyond the drug-related disruptions of earlier years. One tension was financial. The management percentages that Holiff received were standard for the industry, but the income flows in Cash's operation were complicated, involving touring revenue, recording royalties, television fees, publishing, and merchandise. And the accounting of all of it required a level of organizational infrastructure that a single manager could not sustainably maintain alone. Holiff had spent years doing much of this work himself, with minimal staff support. By the early 1970s, he was exhausted in a way that the letters begin to document more openly. A second tension was about credit and visibility. The entertainment industry runs on a kind of mythology about its great figures, a mythology that tends to flatten the people around them into supporting roles or remove them entirely. Cash's public persona, by the early 1970s, was the product of a complex, collaborative effort involving musicians, producers, writers, his wife, and his manager. But the narrative around him emphasized the lone visionary quality that was genuinely part of him while making invisible the infrastructure that made his consistency possible. Holiff was not, by his son's account, a man who craved public recognition, but there is a difference between not craving recognition and not noticing its absence. The third tension, the one that the archive documents most obliquely, was about belonging. Holiff was Jewish, Canadian, analytically minded, and constitutionally unsuited to the Southern gospel and country music world that Cash increasingly inhabited as his career matured. Cash's faith was genuine and growing. The circle around Cash, the people who traveled with him and spent time at the Cash home in Hendersonville, Tennessee, was a world Holiff was adjacent to but never inside. This is not a story of prejudice. There is no evidence in the record that Holiff was treated badly by Cash or Cash's family on religious or cultural grounds. But being professionally essential to someone and personally peripheral to their life is its own experience, and it wears on a person across a decade. In 1973, Holiff resigned. He was 45 years old. He wrote Cash a letter. Cash, by several accounts, did not react with the gravity the situation called for. The transition to new management happened, the touring and recording continued, the Johnny Cash machine kept moving, and Saul Holiff went back to Victoria. He attempted, in subsequent years, to develop other aspects of his career, some business ventures, some continued involvement in entertainment at a smaller scale. None of it had the significance of the Cash years. He did not do interviews about his time with Cash. He did not write a memoir. He gave no accounts to the biographers who periodically wrote about Cash and who, as a result, wrote about Holiff sparingly or not at all. The major Cash biographies of the 1990s and 2000s, including the memoir Cash Published with Patrick Carr in 1997, treat Holiff as a period detail, a name attached to a phase of the career rather than a person whose contributions shaped the arc of it. What Holiff did instead was document. The archive his son found was not a passive accumulation of papers someone forgot to throw away. It was deliberate. Holiff had kept copies of his letters, the replies, the telegrams, the contracts, the financial records, the schedules, the correspondence with venues and networks and record executives. He had the reel-to-reel tapes of phone calls he had recorded, apparently with some regularity, across his management years. He had diaries. It was the archive of a man who understood that his side of the story was not going to be told unless he preserved the evidence for it himself. There is something both quietly dignified and quietly devastating about that. He maintained this material for 30 years without doing anything with it. Whatever he thought its value was, he did not act on that value during his lifetime. Jonathan Holiff's documentary is, in a sense, the project his father spent decades preparing for without ever undertaking. The tapes are the most striking element of what Jonathan found. Phone conversations between Saul and Cash, between Saul and industry figures, between Saul and June Carter, recorded in a pre-wiretapping law era when such recording was legally permissible but was not common practice. Holiff recorded them because he was, at his core, a man who documented things. What they reveal, when played and transcribed and placed in context, is a working relationship more complicated and more unequal than the public record suggested. Cash was not cruel to Holiff. The tapes do not contain evidence of contempt or conscious dismissal. What they contain is something more familiar and in some ways more troubling. A man of enormous talent and charisma who did not, in his bones, fully register the weight of what he asked of the people who kept his life running. Cash was capable of great warmth and great carelessness in approximately equal measure, and Holiff received both without being able to do much about either. One exchange, described in Jonathan's documentary but not reproduced verbatim, concerns a period when Cash had made a commitment without consulting Holiff that directly contradicted a commitment Holiff had already made on Cash's behalf to a third party. Holiff's response on the tape is controlled. He explains the problem methodically. Cash's response is something between apologetic and breezy. He is sorry, he didn't think. It'll work out. Holiff, on tape, says it will be taken care of. Holiff, presumably after hanging up, had to take care of it. Multiply that exchange across 14 years, across the pill-related cancellations and the unilateral decisions and the management of an operation that Cash was often too impaired or too distracted to understand was being managed. And you arrive at 1973 and at the letter and at the silence afterward. Cash did acknowledge Holiff, eventually, in the 1997 memoir, in a passage that described him as a good manager and a good man. It was brief. It was late. It was, by the standard of what the archive documents, inadequate to the actual weight of the relationship. But it was also probably what Cash genuinely felt, which is itself part of the story. That Cash valued Holiff, appreciated him in some real sense, and still could not, in his memoir written near the end of his life, bring himself to describe in any detail what Holiff had actually done. The Folsom Prison album went on to be certified platinum multiple times. The Johnny Cash Show ran for 2 seasons and featured nearly every major American and international performer of its era. The Carnegie Hall booking in 1962 is cited by music historians as a turning point in Cash's mainstream crossover. The television specials that Holiff negotiated in the mid-1960s built the audience that made the ABC show possible. These are facts that exist in the record. They are not in dispute. What is in dispute, or rather, what has simply been absent from the conversation, is the degree to which these things happened because someone other than Johnny Cash was doing the unglamorous, difficult, unrecognized work of making them happen. Saul Holiff died by suicide on April 23, 2005, at the age of 77. Cash had died 2 years earlier, in September 2003, 4 months after June. The timing means that Holiff never had to decide, while Cash was alive, whether to tell his side of the story. He had lived with the silence for 30 years. Whether that silence was peace or something else is not clear from the archive, because Holiff's diaries, by his son's account, are not confessional documents. They are a manager's diaries, orderly, factual, the record of a man who processed his life through documentation rather than expression. Jonathan Holiff's documentary made a small mark in the world it was aimed at. It won some festival attention. It received coverage in outlets that cover music history. It did not rewrite the received narrative around Johnny Cash in any lasting way. That narrative, the man in black, the American rebel, the voice from the margin, is too embedded to be significantly altered by the recovery of one manager's archive. But it put Saul Holiff's name into the conversation in a form more substantial than a footnote, which is something. The question the archive raises is not whether Cash was a great artist. He was. The question is what it costs, and who pays it, to make a great artist's career function at the level that makes them legendary. The answer, in this case, involved a man who kept meticulous records, who negotiated agreements that Cash was too impaired or too famous or too instinctively self-focused to negotiate himself, who absorbed the professional consequences of someone else's disorder for 14 years, and who then went home and did not talk about it. That is what the business deal looked like. Not a single transaction, not a contract signed and broken, but an accumulating arrangement between two men, one of whom got everything he was owed by history, and one of whom, for a long time, did not.